Thanks, Joe.
Good, boss. I don't want to disturb your... Drink iced tea, lemonade, soft drink. Some drink for you, iced tea, lemonade, soft drink.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Learning Curve and the spectacular lecture that you will receive today. I don't know why it's spectacular, but that's what was written in the notes for my introduction. My name is Paul Fisher, and I welcome you here to Vivace, and together with the Learning Curve, we are Tucson's preeminent salon of food and thought. And if you have been here before, you will know that you will get a delicious lunch and a fantastic lecture. So given that this lecture has run incredibly long, this introduction will now end. And yes, well, it won't be too bad after the lecture's finished, I hope. So, I am here to talk about this fellow, John Muir. And to be honest with you, it was a challenge from the very beginning. After all, he was 76 years old when he died, which means that I have less than a minute for each year of his life. He also wrote 300 magazine articles, 10 major books, and traveled to 23 states and 28 countries, all of which I would like to cover today. So, before we begin, we should establish that this is how we look when we go hiking today. This is John Muir's hiking outfit. And it didn't vary very much except for maybe a jacket, gloves, and hobnail boots every once in a while. But also, before we start, as context, because this is not just about John Muir, but his legacy, he was an abused child. His father beat him every day and forced him to memorize the New Testament and made him into a child laborer, which he stayed until he was 21 years old. And in my opinion, this forced him away from people and into nature, and he embraced nature in a major way. To be honest, I was exhausted just after reading his chronology. And if you are interested in the best chronology, it's on the Sierra Club website. So, our chappie, Johnny, born in Dunbar, Scotland, he's the third of 8 children and the first boy. His father, Daniel, was born in Manchester, England, which probably explains why he was so cruel, because Scottish people cannot be that cruel. But he married a woman from Dunbar who inherited a prosperous grain and feed store. Unfortunately, she died within a year of their marriage. And so they were living at that time in this house in Dunbar, Scotland. And Daniel then, very soon after the death of his first wife, married his second wife, Anne Gilree Muir, and she is the mother of John and all the other children in the family. They were an ideal couple. I mean, she loved nature, gathered flowers, wrote poetry, enjoyed music, painting, and Daniel, who was a religious zealot, forbade idolatry of any kind, prohibited music, dancing, jokes, or pictures on the walls. Meals were Spartan and taken in silence. John Muir is born a year after Queen Victoria assumed the throne and Martin Van Buren is president. I also would like to say that during the course of this lecture, it's going to be apparent how many changes happened in this period of time. Particularly from the 1840s through to the early 1900s, the world changed under our feet. And John Muir was in the heart of everything. John Muir writes about his life in Dunbar, and because I am a Brit and he is Scottish, I am forced to use my worst possible Scottish accent to talk in the manner of John Muir. So, here we go. When I was a boy in Scotland, I was fond of everything that was wild, and all my life I've been growing fonder and fonder of wild places and wild creatures. I loved to wander in the fields along the seashore to gaze and wonder at the shells and seaweeds and eels and crabs in the pools among the rocks when the tide was low. And best of all, to watch the waves during awful storms. Now, he never lost his passion for storms. He ran up an earthquake of moving boulders after he first arrived in Yosemite. When everyone else is running away, he is screaming, "A noble earthquake!" And he is running up these boulders to get the feeling of what it's like to be an earthquake, in an earthquake, and he actually hides himself behind a sequoia tree, which maybe is the reason that he loved them so much. He also had the habit of climbing up the tallest tree in the environment when it was storming, lashing himself to the top of the tree so he could feel the blast of the storm. 1844 is the first telegraph transmission in the U.S. In 1845, John Muir enters Dunbar Grammar School, where he studies Latin, French, English, mathematics, and geography. He reads about natural history in a school reader and is especially fascinated by America's fauna and, as described by this chap, Alexander Wilson, and, of course, our first racist of the lecture, John Audubon. Wilson is regarded as the greatest American ornithologist prior to Audubon. I'm sure he loved that. This is the time of manifest destiny. I'm sure you all have heard this phrase. It was coined in 1845 by a magazine editor by the name of John O'Sullivan, and the idea is that Americans are culturally and racially superior, new Americans, to all the other races previously here, which drew my attention to the fact that I must be racially superior to all of you because I arrived in America only like 40 years ago. The rapid expansion of the United States had intensified the issue of slavery as these new states arrived, and were they going to be slave states or were they going to be free states? And these issues fed the fires of civil war. At the same time, Colt becomes the preeminent gun manufacturer in the U.S., and it is given credit for the success of the westward expansion. And we need to understand that word success. in a very different manner. It is also 1848, which brings us the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. We get Texas. In February 1849, Daniel, unbelievably dissatisfied with the Church of Scotland's supposed religious leniency, announces, "Bounds, you needn't learn your lessons the nicht, for we're sailing to America in the morning." And it's absolutely true. None of the family had any idea that he'd even booked the passage on the ship. But truly, they went to bed the one night, got up the next morning, and they were off on the ship. So they took a sailing ship to America. This is not the actual ship, but this is what those ships look like. And after 6 weeks, after joyful hours spent with endless ocean vistas and shanty-singing sailors, the Muirs landed in New York City. 1850. They pay a farmer to carry them 100 miles by wagon into the hinterlands, and John comments, "In leaving Scotland, father, like many other home seekers, burdened himself with too much luggage." And if you have ever read about the European settlers that arrive at this time, this is an understatement. From the age of 11 to 21, Muir works the 160-acre property as his father's unpaid laborer. During this period, however, unbelievably, given that he's working on the farm, studying for school, and memorizing the New Testament, he has time to invent clocks, barometers, hydrometers. These are all things that he invented himself, table saws, and other such items. One of my favorites, his early rising machine, which was attached to a bedstead and set the sleepers up on their feet in the morning. No, thank you. The family moves from Fountain Lake Farm to Hickory Hill Farm, and Muir nearly dies from choke or black damp while digging a well. And that is a form of gas poisoning that you get if you go too far down with no ventilation. This is just the first of many of his near-death experiences, which we will talk about. He writes, though, "This sudden plash into pure wildness, baptism in nature's warm heart, how utterly happy it made us, nature streaming into us wooingly, teaching her wonderful glowing lessons." September the 1st, 1859, there is a massive solar flare with the energy of 10 billion atomic bombs, and that night telegraph communications around the world began to fail. There were reports of sparks showering from the machines, shocking operators, and setting papers on fire. Also in 1859, Darwin publishes On the Origin of the Species, and Richard Owen gives a lecture establishing the fossil record showing a real missing link for the first time. So all this stuff is going on. In September, J.M. exhibits his inventions. This is an actual poster from that exhibit at the State Fair in Madison, Wisconsin, and receives recognition for his talent. He also meets Jean Carr as a judge of the exhibits. Now, J.M. calls this lady, Jean Carr, his spiritual mother. She opens his whole being to a spiritual and relationship with nature. She encourages him to write and sends his work to East Coast publishers, starting his rise to become one of the nature's then and now most remarkable campaign journalists, given what he achieved. When J.M. told his father that he was about to leave home and inquired whether his father would ever send him a little money if he needed it, well, let's remember that he had been working as a slave for his father for over 10 years. His father compassionately says, "No, depend entirely on yourself." Abraham Lincoln is elected president. 1861, February, he enrolls at the University of Wisconsin and attends for almost 2.5 years. He takes classes in chemistry and studies botany, and as a result, he experiences his first major epiphany about the orderliness of nature and what Mother Nature has achieved. He learns about geology from Dr. Ezra S. Carr, who is the husband of Jean Carr. and the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1864, begins. As a foreigner, I was shocked to discover that of the 2.2 million Americans that signed up for the war, 1.1 million became casualties. At the time, it was bloodier than all the previous wars combined. Immigrants in 1862 who did not consider themselves American rioted against the draft. In 1864, John travels to Canada and remains there for 2 years. Whether he dodged the draft during the American Civil War is still really in contention. He botanizes in Ontario, discovering the rare orchid, the Calypso borealis, the subject of his first writing in the Boston Recorder. Abraham Lincoln signs a bill granting Yosemite Valley and Mariposa Big Tree Grove to California as state park lands. But as you can see, it's a tiny little bit of what becomes the park. And this is not Muir yet. This is just happening in the country. In 1865, he uses his inventive abilities, remember he's in Canada now, to improve manufacturing at the Trout's factory in Ontario. And this is his sketch of the little cabin that he builds up there. And I point out his graphic abilities because I will compare them to other naturalists of the time. Lincoln is assassinated. In April 1866, the Ontario factory where Muir has been working burns down, and he returns immediately to the USA. I am sure there is no connection in those two events. He becomes employed as a foreman and engineer at a carriage factory in Indianapolis, and he automates the machinery there. They obviously hadn't heard about the previous factory burning down. In 1867, he is blinded by a factory accident. He's using a file on a grindstone, and it slips out of his hand and straight into his right eye. His cornea is pierced, and after weeks of agony cared by Catherine Merrill, his sight returns. It doesn't return fully for 3 or 4 months. But during his recuperation, he determined that if his eye was spared, he would devote the remainder of his life to Mother Nature's inventions and not the inventions of man. He returns home, where his father berates him for walking in the paths of the devil. He makes John pay for his room and board. John, incensed, responds, "You may be sure it will be a long time before I come again." It was. April 1867, September the 1st, after months of recuperation due to the eye injury, Muir sets out on his 1,000-mile walk, which takes him all the way down from Indianapolis to the Florida Keys. And his idea is to get to Florida and then walk to South America and the source of the Amazon. He was a man with little vision, you know. It took him approximately 7 months to reach Florida, and he is an early victim of fake news, given that his so-called 1,000-mile walk is actually 900 Muir miles. Muir sported a bushy beard with longish hair tucked into a cap. He wore sturdy shoes, grey trousers, a jacket, a shirt with money concealed in a hidden pocket, and he had a rubberized backpack containing a change of underwear for 7 months, soap, towel, comb, brush, and a 5-pound New Testament, which was not for self-defense. He also carried a homemade plant press and a small leather-bound journal. On the inside flap, the 29-year-old Muir writes, "John Muir, Earth Planet, Universe." It is believed that during his 8-day stay, Muir's environmental and ethical and philosophical beliefs that undergird the American conservation movement took place here at the Bonaventure Cemetery. And this is another one of his fabulous sketches, which is actually him lying right by that tree right there. When the journalist Dan Chapman arrived in Bonaventure and asked about John Muir, the volunteer worker told him, nobody cares, nobody knows who he was. Who is he, by the way? Dan Chapman duplicated the walk in 2021 in a road running southward, and the book is truly disturbing. James B. Hunt writes in Restless Fires, Muir was ill-prepared for the rigors of the walk. Had he fully known the practical obstacles to his health, his personal safety, and his physical well-being, one wonders whether he would have made the journey at all. I think this man just wrote the book without reading anything about John Muir, because I don't think he was worried in any way. He wasn't concerned for his personal safety, and he wanted to die a glorious death. And he tried really hard. John Muir is appalled upon entering the small towns along his route. He describes them as poor, rickety, thrice dead, and incredibly dreary, shabby, and very filthy villages. He wrote, the Atlantic coast from Maine to Georgia has been mostly scorched into melancholy ruins. Rare today are the locations on the Muir's route that resemble life in 1867. Since Muir, the grizzly bear, manatee, bald eagle, deer, panthers, otters, green turtles, and oysters have been driven to the verge of extinction. 1868, after he arrives in Florida getting ready to walk to the source of the Amazon, he nearly dies from malaria. So he gives up his walk to the Amazon and sails to California. After hopping off the boat in San Francisco on March the 28th, 1868, he asks a passerby, the quickest way out of this chaotic city. Where do you want to go, the passerby asks. And John Muir responds, anywhere that is wild. And the passerby points, and John Muir starts walking east. From April to June, he keeps walking from San Francisco to Yosemite, and if I say Yosemite every once in a while, it's because I'm ignorant and British. And that is approximately 170 miles. He gets there in 1869, and he writes, Mr. Delaney, a sheep owner for whom I had worked a few weeks, called on me and offered to engage me to go with his shepherd and flock to the headwaters of the Merced and the Tulalumé rivers, the very region I had in mind. He spends his first summer in the Sierra. John Muir is so closely associated with Yosemite Park because he helped draw up its boundaries in 1889. He wrote the magazine articles that led to his creation in 1890, and he co-founded the Sierra Club in 1892 to protect it. He spends hours watching a single creature or natural feature whilst writing luminous descriptions in his journal, and he lies on ice for long stretches finding out what it's like to be a glacier. And it works. He makes the first ever ascent of Cathedral Peak in what is now Yosemite National Park, which is a mere 1,896 feet. He never meets a mountain that's too high, and this one is too low. It is estimated that over the course of his life, he had at least 22 near-death experiences, one of which is he jumps up in the middle of the night and sees a moonbow because of spray from a waterfall. He runs behind the waterfall, glorying in the moonbow, when suddenly he starts being hit. He realizes that he is in a tiny meteor shower that is heading straight for the waterfall, and so he has to shimmy out of the waterfall and across these ice blocks and cling on to them until the meteor shower ends. More than 1,500 deaths have been recorded in the park since 1851. 1870, Muir winters in the Yosemite Valley and works for James M. Hutchins, he proprietor of the Hutchins House Hotel. J.M. builds and runs a sawmill for Hutchins and a cabin for himself. Muir maintains all his life that they only used trees that had fallen naturally, but the fact that he built this mill, his enemies use against him for the rest of his life. He begins guiding tours of Yosemite, which makes him one of America's first nature guides. In 1871, This chap, Ralph Waldo Emerson, visits Yosemite. Now, Muir had read much of Emerson's work and was influenced greatly by his writings about nature. Emerson was in his late 60s, Muir in his 30s. Muir wrote, "I heard that in 3 or 4 days he was going away, and in the course of sheer desperation, I wrote him a note and carried it to his hotel, telling him that El Capitan and Half Dome demanded him to stay longer." Well, Muir read the note, and he went to see Muir, and Muir wanted Emerson to camp with him in the Wawana Grove, but Emerson's traveling companions wouldn't allow the aging essayist to do so. Emerson offered Muir a teaching position at Harvard, but Muir turned it down. I point Emerson's age out because we're going to see what John Muir was still doing when he was in his early 60s. Of Emerson, Muir wrote, "Emerson was the most serene, majestic, sequoia-like soul I ever met. The Sierra, I was sure, wanted to see him, and he must not go before gathering them an interview. He was as sincere as the trees, his eyes as sincere as the sun." Of Muir, Emerson wrote, "There was a wonderful charm to his presence, his smile, his serene eye, his voice, his manner were all sensed at once by everybody. I felt here was a man I had been seeking." Emerson makes J.M. one of my men. And if you've heard about this list, it was a coveted list to get on because Emerson promoted these men. And this was one of the ways that he started getting national attention. On December the 5th, the New York Tribune, and this is the actual, obviously we can't read it very well, but this is the paper, publishes Muir's first article from California entitled Yosemite Glaciers. Also in 1861, the Smithsonian requested reports on Muir's mountain ramblings. Muir focused on the Earth and its geologic history. So he's only been in Yosemite for 3 years, and the Smithsonian is already reaching out to him. And this is his life. He starts, people come to him, he converts them, and slowly but surely almost everybody of any eminence that's interested in nature comes to visit John Muir. In 1872, he spends winter working on his writings about Yosemite. Muir's articles, Yosemite Valley in Flood, 20 Hill Hollow, Living Glaciers of California, are published in this actual edition of the Overland Monthly. President Grant establishes Yellowstone as the first U.S. national park. Lincoln's Yosemite was just a land grant, and both of these are not Muir yet. The national and state parks were created for the pleasure and recreation of the wealthy classes. Not only did the poorer classes have no time or money for recreation, but the parks weren't even marketed to them. And Muir supported the railroads because they were essential for this tourism and his travel. Aaron Montgomery Ward, however, opened the first mail-order retail business and issued a one-page catalog featuring nearly 150 items. Watch your back, Amazon. 1873. March the 25th, the Boston Evening Transcript publishes J.M. the Hetch Hetchy Valley. The name Hetch Hetchy comes from a Sierra Miwok word for a type of wild grass. J.M. writes, and it's important to remember this, "The view of Hetch Hetchy Valley from my first standpoint is one of the grandest I ever beheld. The whole glorious engraving is reposed at such an angle that you look full upon its surface near and far, breathing in atmosphere of beauty and love." It was one of his favorite places in Yosemite. Muir winters in Oakland and begins writing articles on Yosemite. With ice axe, felt hat, and hobnail boots, Muir climbed and studies California's tallest mountains, including Mount Whitney, 14,500 feet, the first recorded ascent by an eastern route, and Mount Shasta, which is 14,400 feet. He makes his first excursion to Kings River Canyon and his first visit to Lake Tahoe in October and November. And talking of firsts, the Jesse James Gang conducts its first train robbery in the West on July the 21st, 1873, in Adair, Iowa. Joseph Whitney, California's state geologist, goes up against Muir when Muir stated that the Ice Age never really ended and the glaciers had shaped Yosemite Valley. Whitney calls Muir a mere sheep herder and an ignoramus. Of course, 60 years later, the U.S. Geological Survey confirmed Muir's science. Through Jean Carr, he meets the woman that will become his wife, Louise Strentzel, and he lives in the Bay Area writing magazines, although he does take a 3-month mule trip to southern Sierra Nevada hunting big redwoods. He begins to write and lobby in public seriously for forest preservation and conservation. And he gives his first public lecture to the Library Institute of Sacramento. And Muir, he's always forward-thinking. He's always thinking about his vision and his mission. He planned this lecture to prove to himself that he could stand in public, do a good presentation, be engaging, have people listen to him, and be persuasive enough for them to go away and do something. His simple, direct approach actually does become a model for scientific research on nature, and his writing style inspires many to take up conservation and related causes. The Sacramento Record Union publishes his articles, God's First Temples, urging government protection of the forests. March the 10th, Alexander Graham Bell says, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," on his first telephone. Also, the Battle of the Little Big Horn. 1877, he leads Professor Asa Gray of Harvard and Sir Joseph Hooker of England's Kew Gardens on an expedition to the Shasta region. These two guys are huge. They are famous all over the world, and now they are coming to John Muir. Asa Gray, this chap here, is considered the most important American botanist of the 19th century, and his Darwiniana was considered an important explanation of how religion and science were not necessarily mutually exclusive. Sir Joseph Dalton was a British botanist and explorer, and he was founder of the Geographical Botany and Charles Darwin's closest friend. He was one of the men that pushed Darwin to publish. November 1877, Muir returns to King Canyon and high regions of the southern Sierra. You can see he is restlessly moving all the time. He visits the family of his future wife and her parents, Dr. and Mrs. Strentzel, before climbing Mount Diablo, a mere 3,849 feet, and returning to Oakland, and his tea was still hot. May. He guides the U.S. Geodetic Survey, which I did not know what was, and it is the size and shape of the Earth and the exact position of items on its surface in the Utah Mountains and Nevada. So now big government organizations are also coming to John, during which time he explores the San Gabriel Mountains of Southern California, visits Salt Lake City, the Great Salt Lake, and meets Mormon families. He loved the singing. Reports of these excursions were sent to the San Francisco Evening Bulletin and later published in Steep Trails. It doesn't come out this year, but all the work for it was done by this time. In 1879, he becomes engaged to Louise Strentzel and then immediately embarks on his first trip to Alaska, traveling with S. Hall Young and some Tlingit tribesmen, of whom Muir wrote, "All the 3 days that we were in the chief's house, everybody did as he liked, coming and going, retiring and getting up when we wished. I never saw a child or servant scolded or punished, which must have been a major shock for him, or any resentment about taking the best place at the fire or the best bits of food. There is such an abundance. This spirit of mine and thine developed into civilized selfishness is never apparent, if it exists at all. Many a good lesson might be learned from these wild children, should they send missionaries to the Christians." Young wrote of Muir, From cluster to cluster of flowers he ran, falling on his knees, babbling in unknown tongues, prattling in a curious mixture of scientific lingo and baby talk, worshipping these little blue and pink goddesses. However, at the end of it, he also writes, I sat at his feet, and at the feet of his spirit I still sit, a student, absorbed, surrendered, beautiful. Muir discovers up there in Alaska, Glacier Bay and Muir Glacier. I have not figured out how it was named after him before he got there, but we're just going to go with it. On New Year's Eve of 1879, Edison lights his laboratory with electric light. 1880. In January, he spends a month in Portland and gives his first public lectures about his travels and discoveries in Alaska. Very, very successful. He also marries Louise Strencel at that time. She's 33, he's 42. He makes his second trip to Alaska. You know, I'm getting the feeling here that he needs to always be sure that Alaska is still there, because within a month, he takes his third trip to Alaska aboard the Corwin. The Corwin carried a scientific detachment, including John Muir, looking for the Jeannette, which had sailed off in 1879 and disappeared. March the 25th, birth of his daughter, Wanda Muir, which is 11 months since marriage, so please, no hanky-panky. Nearby, Mount Wanda is named in her honor. J.M. visits John Swett, this chap here, who is the father of public school education in California. So his range of people is not just these naturalists, but anybody that he thinks can help him or help promote what he wants to do. Swett founded the California's Teachers Association, and John Muir often stayed with him in San Francisco during the winter months to write his articles. It is possible that his relationship with Swett influenced his rhapsodic and engaging writing style to make his observations and scientific discoveries enjoyable and understandable to the average reader and children. And at that time, scientific journals would not have been accessible to these people. 1882, he becomes a rancher and fruit farmer. This is his father-in-law right here. For 8 years, he becomes a partner in the Strensel's large fruit ranch until he felt he had made enough to take care of his family. Then he retired from active ranching and returned to writing and working for the conservation cause. Eventually, his writings and lectures brought in additional money. The crops at the ranch were grapes, apples, quince, and elderberry. When he died, John Muir was worth over $1 million. Yeah, I know. I mean, it actually says 1 to 3, but I'm going with the low bar here. And at the same time, in 1882, the ampersand is dropped from the alphabet in American schools. Now, 1883, this is true. This is true. In 1883, several of Muir's articles are reprinted in school readers. And if any of you have seen the TV series 1883 or have studied the westward expansion, this was a time of incredible lawlessness, murder, urban blight. And yet, throughout all of his travels, John Muir is untouched by this. It's like he's living in his own rarefied zone. In 1884, 4 years after their Muir takes Louie, his wife, on their first trip to Yosemite together. So instead of taking her on like a little path, he takes her on a mile-long hike straight up a mountainside, which she is completely ill-prepared for. And so she begins to stumble. So he gets his walking stick and sticks it in her back and starts pushing her up the hill. She complains that it's hurting, so he wraps his cap around the stick and sticks it back in his back and keeps pushing her up the hill. Thank goodness for Louie, a mule train is coming up the hill at that time, and she hitches a ride. To this day, he always said, well, not to this day, but to his dying day, he said that he was just trying to help her not fall over. In 1885, he travels through Portland en route to see his family in Wisconsin. He visits and writes about Yellowstone National Park, and he has a premonition that his father is dying. So he gathers up his siblings for one last visit. Daniel Muir, his father, dies in Kansas City, Missouri. This is one of the oldest photographs of Kansas City that exists. And it is 20 years since they last parted. So John did keep his word. It will be a long time before you see me again. In 1886, birth of his second child, Helen Muir, and Helen, at an early age, developed a love for locomotives. So her father sold a right-of-way on his property to the Santa Fe Railroad for a nominal fee of $10. And from diaries and letters, even though he was this man, and he had a very loving and understanding relationship with his family. Louis Muir often urged her husband to go to the mountains for his health, and he worked so hard and long on the ranch that he sometimes got below 100 pounds, which is really thin for a man who is 5'10". And Louis was very supportive of his fight for conservation and the traveling the cause required. Often when he would come back from 3 months in the wilderness, she would encourage him to go out again, and this may have been because of his personal odor that is remarked upon by almost everybody that ever met him. On October the 28th, the unveiling of the Statue of Liberty. In 1887, he begins work as editor and author of Picturesque California. And we have this chap up here because he showed Muir Woods, obviously, to this noted British evolutionist Alfred Lord Wallace. And this poor chap was also right there with the theory of evolution, but he didn't get his papers back to the Royal Society in time, and Darwin gets published first. But even he is coming to California to learn from John Muir, and this man has been all over the world. Muir climbs Mount Rainier in 1888, which is 14,500 feet, and he founds the campsite at 10,000 feet, which is still as high as you can go on Mount Rainier. This is the site. While in Portland, he wrote, "The wedges of development are being driven hard, and none of the obstacles and defenses of nature can long withstand the onset of this immeasurable industry." He meets William Gladstone Steele, this is this chap here, who had founded a group called the Mazamas before the Sierra Club, which was up there in Portland to defend the Portland's wild spaces. And he's also best known as the father of Crater Lake National Park. He also connects with Philemon Van Trump, who made the first successful ascent of Mount Rainier in 1870, and he becomes JM's collaborator. Picturesque California in 2 volumes is published. Muir is editor and contributor. After a camping trip with Muir in 1889 in Yosemite, and this is the beginning of many stories, Century magazine editor Robert Underwood Johnson encourages Muir to write the articles that will lead to the creation of Yosemite National Park. Muir inspires the nation with his writing. Sublime domes and canyons, dark upsweeping forests and glorious arrays of white peaks deep in the sky. Every feature glowing, radiating beauty that pours into our flesh and bones like heat rays from fire. And Johnson and his friends are in the East lobbying Congress to establish the park. 1890, his 4th trip to Alaska, and a 10-day solo expedition by sled along Muir Glacier, obviously to get to know himself a little better. Campbell soup, Nabisco crackers, and Coca-Cola are introduced. In the December edition of the Aberdeen Sunday Pioneer in 1890, Frank L. Baum writes, "The whites, by law of conquest, by justice of civilization, are masters of the American continent, and the best safety of the frontier settlements will be secured by the total annihilation of the few remaining Indians." And this is not the only reason I think of him. I mean, he did write this at this year and published it. But also, I imagine that when John Muir, having grown up in the greyness of Scotland and the industrialization of the East, when he got off the boat in California and looked out at what he saw, it must have been like Dorothy walking into the Technicolor out of her little shack, because he must have shocked him in that way. In the December, and Wounded Knee occurs, so maybe these soldiers had read Frank L. Baum's article, because about 300 Lakota men, women, and children were slaughtered by U.S. soldiers, and you know it was a slaughter, not a battle. 1890, the first result of the writing and lobbying inspires Congress to designate Yosemite as a national park. Benjamin Harrison is president. Not even tourists, however, en route to Yosemite were spared from JM's criticism. A strange show they made, winding single file through the solemn woods in gaudy attires, scaring the wild creatures, and one might fancy even the great pines would be disturbed and groan aghast. I mean, he actually wanted these people to come to Yosemite. Muir campaigns for the King Canyon National Park, which would take another 49 years, and for Sequoia National Park, which he lives to see established. He corresponds with George... not you. Go back. Thank you. This chap here, George Stewart, who is the editor of the Visalia Times-Delta, and he is known as the father of the Sequoia National Park. And the 1890 census is the first to be compiled using punch cards and tabulated by machines. Robert Johnson, and no, not this Robert Johnson, this one, yes, thank you, suggested an association for preserving California's natural wonders, the management and protection of Yosemite National Park, and this set the stage for an advocacy group, which would include Muir. The formal meeting was held in San Francisco on June the 4th, 1892, and incorporation papers were signed. Muir hoped the Sierra Club would be able to do something for wildness and make the mountains glad. Unanimously, he was chosen as the first president. Now, by the end of this lecture, we will reveal which one of these missions best represents the club today. The first one, or the one that we see on the website today. I'll tell you. But what does this have to do with this? This. Why did they have to do this? Well, I'm going to give you two examples, but there really were many more. First is this chap, Joseph LeConte. And if you read the byline under his picture, you will see that his family celebrated the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He was the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1891, a member of the American Philosophical Society and the National Academy of Science. And he becomes close friends with J.M. after a trip to Yosemite. LeConte co-founded the Sierra Club with Muir, serving on the club's board of directors from 1892 to 1898. John Muir wrote that LeConte could talk on the lessons of the day, blending art, science, and philosophy with whatever we had seen. Any one of us, by asking a question, no matter what subject, made his thoughts pour forth and shine like rain. As a respected scientist and professor, LeConte would become an advocate for Muir's unorthodox yet ultimately vindicated theories about the glacial origins of Yosemite Valley. And because he was such an esteemed scientist, it made a big deal that he supported Muir. And LeConte wrote, "The Negro race is certainly at present incapable of self-government and unworthy of the ballot, and their participation can only result in disaster. The white race should be the only self-governing race." But he's just a the beginning. This is the man that shocked the heck out of me. This guy's name is David Starr Jordan, and he served as a director of the Sierra Club from 1892 to 1903, but he was a vocal advocate for white supremacy and eugenics. Jordan was a kingpin of the eugenics movement and pushed for forced sterilization laws, and he co-founded the Human Betterment Foundation, whose research and model laws were used to create Nazi Germany's eugenics legislation. Yes, this is one of the heritages of the Sierra Club. Muir himself made some derogatory comments about black people. He wrote, "One energetic white man working with a will could easily pick as much cotton as half a dozen Sambos and Sallys." I know. However, Muir did later recognize and appreciate the achievements of indigenous people. I don't know about his feelings towards African Americans. And he spoke about the equality of all people and the importance of making public lands accessible to all. And his story about the Tlingit tribesmen and sitting around the fire and them sending mail. He did have this in himself, but he was a man of his time. Muir's racist legacy is disputed, but it's hard to find the positive comments you might be looking for. So, in 1892, his brother David and his family moved to the Martinez Ranch, relieving J.M. of the burden of ranch management. Muir is completely free to return to the wilderness in his efforts to save it. So this is the ranch here, and then coming over this way is Yosemite National Park. Congress moves towards creating 3 more national parks, with Muir assuming the role of chief conservation cheerleader. Mount Rainier in 1897, Petrified Forest in 1906, and the Grand Canyon in 1919. This is the Gilded Age. It is also the second industrial revolution, where mass production is changing the way Americans dressed, shopped, and ate. That would be all Americans except for John Muir. Muir takes an East Coast trip. May the 1st to October the 30th, he stops at the Chicago World's Fair, and he finds it a cosmopolitan rat's nest. And of course, everybody else in the world thought it was the most incredible exhibition that had ever been staged. But he was enchanted, as we all were, by the tens of thousands of the electric lights that Edison hung at and it would have been the first time that anybody had been in a huge space with everything lit with electric light. In New York, Century editor Robert Underwood Johnson takes Muir on a succession of luncheons and champagne dinners in his honor. Muir remarks in a letter home, "I had no idea I was so well known, considering how little I have written." Johnson introduces J.M. to Mark Twain, Rudyard Kipling, and Nikola Tesla, among many others, and they all want to come and meet him. 1894, he takes a trip to Europe. Whilst in London on September the 1st, 1893, he visits John Hooker of Kew Gardens, you remember him, and he had guided him through the Shasta region, and he writes, "Sir Joseph had accompanied Ross," this is Ross right here, "in his famous Antarctic expedition and naturalist, and he showed me a large number of sketches he made of the great ice cap. And as you can see, it looks like Hooker had a bit more of an artistic talent than our Johnny boy did." And he also had long talks, because he was a learner as well as a talker and a listener, about Huxley, Tyndall, Darwin, Asa Gray, and Sir Charles Lyell, who I was not familiar with. He established the popularity and credibility of geology as a science. On his return from Europe, he goes with Robert Underwood Johnson to Washington, D.C. to lobby the Secretary of the Interior, Hoke Smith, who, as the 58th governor of Georgia, where this is a campaign rally for Hoke right here, would sign a bill to disenfranchise African-American voters in 1907. Some things never change. J.M. campaigns for the creation of Mount Rainier National Park, which is established in 1899, and his first book, The Mountains of California, is published. He is now getting through to everybody who has any interest whatsoever. So by now, the progressive era is in full swing, and Muir would connect the nation's social and political activism for the struggle between preservationists and conservationists. Now, conservationists are interested in the preservation of natural resources, whereas preservation is associated with the protection of buildings, objects, and just the landscapes, ma'am, not what is behind them. Yet it was clear by the 1990s that the growth at all cost mantra was poisoning America. This is not a local, this is a picture from back then. The forests were clear-cut, the waterways were already polluted, there were great pools of smoke from burning coal shrouding cities, and farmers were eroding fields and ruining streams. Virtually all the larger mammals, wolves, elk, deer, bear, bison, and otter had been hunted to near extinction. 1895, Muir turns 57 years old. Muir and Professors LeConte, boo, and William Dudley, speak on preserving national parks and forest reserves at the annual meeting of the Sierra Club. And Dudley, again, a man coming to see Muir, his collection built at Stanford is still considered to be one of the most important contributions to the knowledge of flora of California. He was key to the establishment of what is now Big Basin's Redwood State Park. And I just love this. We look at the sequoia as this massive thing from far away, but look at its bark. It's just fabulous. I think so. 1896, J.M. joins the U.S. Forestry Commission. Now, they want him too, in July on a survey of the forests of the Yellowstone, the Black Hills in South Dakota, the Big Horn Mountains in Wyoming, and forests in Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. Just a wee stroll. He meets with the Mazamas Mountaineering Club, and by 1896, the Mazamas and the Sierra Club are working together on numerous conservation activities. So by this time, he had been to his 23 states. He had been to Alaska, Arizona, California, Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Idaho, Indiana, Kentucky, Maine, Massachusetts, Montana, Nevada, New York, North Carolina, Oregon, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, Washington, D.C., Washington State, and Wisconsin. Yes, I know. Which he had never been able, thank you very much, without the railroads. J.M. surveys the Cascades. I don't think he does all of them, but quite a bit, I am sure. The Santa Lucia coastal ranges, the mountains of Southern California, and the Grand Canyon and the Southern Sierra Nevada. Muir feels a strong premonition about the health of his mother. It's something psychic about this puppy because he felt the same thing about his dad. And he gathers his brother David and the rest of his family and he travels to Wisconsin, whereupon on June the 23rd, Muir's mother, Anne Gilree Muir, dies. On August the 5th, John, along with his brother David, registered to vote in Contra Costa County in California. Muir receives an honorary Master of Arts degree from Harvard University and makes his 5th trip to Alaska. Now, this is the Muir Glacier, and this is 1941, and this is today. He would not have been able to take that sled ride, would he, in 2004? William Kinley is elected president, and he is indifferent to conservation. J.M. is awarded a Doctor of Laws degree from the University of Wisconsin and makes a 6th trip to Alaska, and to his astonishment, it is still there. Muir's articles on forest preservation are now being published in Harper's Weekly and the Atlantic Monthly. So people all over the country are reading his work now. And it creates much more popular support for preserving forests and the wild. J.J. Thomson discovers the electron. And in 1898, he visits Washington, D.C. again to lobby and sightsee. Muir travels to Montreal, St. Lawrence River, Maine, scales Vermont's highest peak, Mount Mansfield, a mountain at mere 4,396 feet, an afternoon saunter in the October snow. And by the way, that is not him. Muir visits Florida and his old friends, the Hodgson family, who had saved his life during his life-threatening bout with malaria in 1867. He writes the Wild Parks and Forest Reservations of the West article, which promotes Mount Rainier National Park along with other places. So on this map, the gray areas are the forest reserves, and these few black areas are the national parks that exist at this time. In 1899, Mount Rainier National Park is established, so you can feel his effect now. In 1899, railroad magnate Edward H. Harriman converted a steamship, the George W. Elder, into a luxury floating university and takes a whole bunch of luminaries, including Muir, to the Aleutian Islands and beyond. This was Muir's 7th trip to Alaska. And in order to promote visitors to Yosemite and the wilderness areas, Harriman and the other railroad barons supported Muir's lobbying as a way to drum up passengers for the new railroads, because they were the railroads, but what would people need to use them for? Well, going from New York to Yosemite, very big deal. For this reason, J.M. needed to be a supporter of the railroads, and both initiatives were so very successful that today, as many of you might know, Yosemite is overrun by at least 4 million tourists who swarm into the park every year. 1900, revisits his old haunts in Sierra Nevada and the headwaters of Truckee, Carlson, Mokelumne, Stanislaus, Calaveras, Walker, and Tulalumne and Merced rivers in the company of C. Hart Harriman, U.S. biologist and chief of the U.S. Biological Survey for 25 years. C. Hart Harriman was one of the first scientists who wanted to promote the need to preserve Native American culture. And he may have been another influence on Muir's changing options and ideas and opinions about indigenous peoples. Muir wrote that Native Americans seemed to have no right place in the landscape. And it's true that Native Americans were cleared from the national forest lands as they were created, a policy that did not change much until the 60s and 70s. In 1901, Our National Parks is published, and J.M. leads the first annual month-long Sierra Club trip to the mountains. Gifford Pinchot, this chap here, the first head of the Forest Service, and Teddy Roosevelt favor a role for the federal lands that didn't outlaw logging, grazing, or hydropower. However, Muir opposes them in an article in Harper's, describing them as these temple destroyers, devotees of ravaging commercialism. And his attitude to TR goes up and down all through TR's life. Teddy Roosevelt becomes president later that year. Queen Victoria dies. I don't think there's a connection. January the 13th, Muir leaves on the train for the Grand Canyon, and he starts planning to write no fewer than 6 new books. J.M. and Charles S. Sargent go to Grandfather Mountain, North Carolina, where Muir belittles Sargent for his aloofness towards nature. And he's certainly feeling his oats at this time, because Sargent was the author of the still monumental works, The Silver of North America and the Manual of the Trees of North America. And that is Silver, S-I-L-V-A, which is about trees and forests in general. But Muir had no problem putting him down. J.M. explores the giant sequoia of the Converse Basin, and this grove is the largest continuous sequoia grove in the world. And Muir still lamenting the horrible destruction of Kings River groves now going on fiercely about the mills. 1903, April 28th, John Muir becomes a naturalized citizen. The Wright brothers take to the air in celebration of Muir's citizenship, and Crater Lake National Park in the Cascade Mountains in Oregon is established. On March the 14th, 1903, J.M. receives a letter from Roosevelt who wants Muir to take him on a tour of Yosemite. T.R. writes, "I do not want anyone else with me but you, and I want to drop politics for 4 days and just be out in the open with you." Roosevelt had begun to worry that America's wilderness could be lost, and he wanted Muir to help him understand what needed conserving, and of all the people in America, he chooses Muir to help him on this journey. Muir's wife, Louie, had to persuade him to postpone his world trip to meet Teddy. He was really reluctant to do so, because remember, he was a temple destroyer. But after the trip, Muir writes, "I never before had met so interesting, hearty, and manly a companion. I fairly fell in love with him." Of Muir, Roosevelt wrote, Muir talked even better than he wrote. And the reason he wrote that was, around the campfire, they both talked, neither of them stopped, and neither of them listened to each other. However, as president, Teddy Roosevelt establishes 230 million acres of public lands, including 5 new national parks. John Muir takes credit, which he should. He really should. 1903 to 1904 takes his first world tour in London. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was there in the same year. It might have been the only time that John Muir ever saw cowboys and Indians. Paris, Berlin, Russia, Finland, Siberia, Korea, China, India, Japan, Egypt, Ceylon, Australia, New Zealand, Malaya, Indonesia, Philippines, Hong Kong, and Hawaii on this first trip. And this is a sketch from his notebook up from the Kazbek station. Again, we don't really make fun of his graphic skills, but the notes in this book are a detailed description of the flora and geology of the region. And he obviously did not get the memo of the ampersand, because you will see them all through here. At the age of 65, and this is the reference back to Emerson, J.M. saunters along the 8-mile Muir Glacier in New Zealand. Yep. In 1905, after his return from the world tour, Muir actively lobbies in Sacramento for state legislation to return all of the Yosemite Valley back to federal control. By this time, there was within the park about 65,000 acres of patented lands and 300 active mines. Muir studies the petrified forest and campaigns for its protection. The next year, the petrified forest is proclaimed a national monument by Roosevelt. August the 5th of that year, Muir's wife, Louie, passes on. 1906, June the 11th, Roosevelt finally signs federal legislation to return Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove to Yosemite National Park after a 17-year campaign. End to the patented lands and the mining claims. Although when John Muir asked Teddy Roosevelt whether he could guarantee that, Teddy Roosevelt said, "Well, I can make the legislation, but it would be the same as me making legislation against gravity. It would not keep your trousers up." So he knew that he could do a little, but there was still nothing, no National Park Service or anything to protect what is there. April the 21st, Muir turned 69 years old, just keeping up. San Francisco pushes to build a reservoir in the Yosemite Hetch Hetchy Valley to provide an ample amount of fresh water for the city. Muir begins the fight to save the Hetch Hetchy Valley, but after the devastating 1906 earthquake and fire in San Francisco, his cause was lost. There was no way they weren't going to build this dam, because they want something like that to happen in San Francisco again. Muir responds, "Mischief makers and robbers of every degree, from Satan to senators, were trying to make everything tolerable." And this does include Teddy Roosevelt. Oh, Matt, sorry, didn't point this out to you, but this is the Hetch Hetchy Valley before and the Hetch Hetchy Valley after. The Grand Canyon National Monument is established in 1908. Theodore Roosevelt proclaims Muir Woods a national monument, and Muir dictates his autobiography as guest of Edward H. Harriman, who was the baron that took him on the trip to Yosemite. At the time of his death, and you can see how much he was beloved by the newspapers, in 1909, Harriman controlled 6 major railroads, and when he died, he was worth approximately $5 billion. But he did not own the railroad that ran through Muir's property. Muir continues the battle to save Hetch Hetchy. Stickeen is published, and the book celebrates, and the review of the book says, the book celebrates the spirit of adventure that drove men like Muir to defy the elements, to gather information about uncharted territory. This is a good introduction to one of America's most respected conservationists. October, Muir leads President Taft through the Yosemite, and also Ballinger, who is Secretary of the Interior, who is still pushing to get the dam built, and that conservation was only good if it didn't interfere with industrialization. At the same time, Leo Baekeland presents one of the first plastics, Bakelite, to the American Chemical Society. He meets John Burroughs, who's one of the great naturalists of that time, at the Grand Canyon and Yosemite, and Burroughs accompanied Muir on the Alaskan expedition and other trips. Burroughs considered Muir one of the greatest seers of the age, and that everybody should sit at his feet and listen to what he said about nature and the world. However, Burroughs said, ask him to tell you about his famous dog story and you will get the whole theory of glaciation thrown in. And it's true. If you invited John Muir to a dinner party, everybody would sit around eating their dinner. He would sit there talking. At the end of the meal, when everybody had finished their plates, he would be sitting in front of a plate of cold food, trying to get everybody to stay and keep listening. Back home in Martinez, he is now becoming more and more depressed, and he's really only got these things that he needs to write. And he describes writing as one eternal grind, but thank goodness to all of us that he did not give it up. And he meets this chap just the once, and Carnegie wrote of him that he is so foolish as to say that the imperative needs of a city to a full and pure water supply should be thwarted for the sake of a few trees or scenery, no matter how beautiful they may be. You can see John Muir's not exactly looking at him in that picture. 1911, Muir's My First Summer in the Sierra is published. Muir makes a speech to the American Alpine Club in New York, and he is awarded an honorary Doctor of Letters degree from Yale University, and he spends time at this chap, Henry Fairfield Osborne's house, who is the first curator and subsequent president of the American Museum of Natural History, who's inviting Muir to come to him so that he can help him with his writings. In August the 11th, not satisfied with his first world trip, he leaves New York for a year-long trip to Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Cuba, India, Kenya, South Africa, Uruguay, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. He travels up the Amazon River, but he doesn't get as far as he wants to. He gets up here, which is around another 1,000 Muir miles, meaning about 900. In October, he explores the forests of the Araucaria basiliensis pine in Brazil and travels to Chile and explores the monkey puzzle tree forests in the Andes Mountains. In 1911, he spends most of the month at sea between South America and Africa, about 4,558 nautical miles. He would have known that. In 1912, he arrives in Cape Town on January the 13th. In 7 days, he is already in Victoria Falls, Zambia, studying the baobab trees. And by February, he is in East Africa at the headwaters of the Nile, which is about a 5,500-mile trip. And I wonder if he was disappointed as I was at looking at that muddy puddle. In March, he goes back to America and has a 30-week, 40,000-mile long voyage. He continues the fight against the destruction of the wilderness of lumber mining and power barons, and Muir's book, The Yosemite, is published. And I put this book up here because I had a look. You can get a new copy of this book for $5.55, but you want a copy of this book and it'll be $2,000. 1913, the battle for Hetch Hetchy is lost, and it's granted to San Francisco for a reservoir. But the fight still continues. He retires to Hetch, and it wears him out completely. He is 75 years old, and the hope is streaming out of him now. He goes back to his empty home and the long, tireless, endless job of writing books. The story of my boyhood and youth is published in 1913, and he visits the Harriman family. Even though the paterfamilias is dead, the family and Muir were really tight, and he is there to write again. And he is awarded an honorary doctor of laws degree by the University of California. He now has 4. I only have 2. On October the 4th, the Los Angeles chapter of the Sierra Club builds the Muir Lodge in his honor, and this sequoia tree sapling was planted as part of the ceremony, and it's still growing on the site, even though the building was destroyed in a flood. He meets with a Japanese college student, Ryozo Azuma, who becomes a Japanese conservationist and is known as the John Muir of Japan. And this year, a BBC documentary that I heard about protest and preservation stated in uncategorical terms that still, if you want an environmental advantage to this day, you need to get the Sierra Club involved. There is no stronger force of change because they have access to lobbying and will help set the agenda. Not a bad legacy at all. And talking of his legacy, the fight to save Hetch Hetchy Valley still continues to this day. So, in 1914, John Muir dies of pneumonia in the California hospital, 4 months after the start of WW1. And he is 76 years old, and he did not die in the wild as he had tried to do so often. His gravesite is by his wife at the Muir Strentzel gravesite, and his funeral is attended by numerous family members and friends who, of course, get there on the train. So this is the site, this is their graves, and these are the people that came to his funeral. So the headline of the obituary on the Los Angeles Times, and this is the actual newspaper with the obituary in it. Earth he loved reclaims him. John Muir, apostle of the wild, is dead. Let's let him have the last words, as he would have surely done was he still alive. All the merry dwellers of the trees and streams and the myriad swarms of the air, called into life by the sunbeam of a summer morning, go home through death, wings folded perhaps in the last red rays of sunset of the first day they were tried. Trees towering in the sky, braving storms of centuries, flowers turning faces to the light for a single day or hour, having enjoyed their share of life's feast, all alike pass on and away under the Lord of death and love. Let children walk with nature, and they will learn that death is stingless indeed, and as beautiful as life, and that the grave has no victory, for it never fights. All is divine harmony. Thank you. Thank you. John Muir. And I knew nothing about him when I started this lecture. But any quick questions? I'm happy to take one or two. I have a bibliography on your tables, give you all the information you need. So if you don't have any need for any more of me, enjoy your lunch, please. Everybody enjoy themselves? Good. Okay. Did you have a good time?